Hey guys, I was looking for a dress to wear to my friend's wedding and decided this would be a good time to sew my first dress. So I thought I would share my process and things that I learned. I used the Anabelle dress pattern. It looked like a nice simple dress. Assembling the templates was easy. I printed the PDF, taped the pieces together, and cut them out. Figuring out my size took me a while. For my first attempt, I just followed my waist size, which was wrong. The bust ended up being too big. Then I went with a smaller size and adjusted it to the waistline, which ended up being a better fit. Since everything fit exactly, I went with the next size up to see if that would look better. I liked having the extra room by the waist, in case I screwed up my size. So I kept that part, but went back to the size in my previous attempt. I also tried to lower the darts, but they came out pointy. I thought maybe it's because I was using this makeshift dome. So I printed these Tailor's ham templates. I cut out my pieces, sewed them, filled it with scraps of cotton fabric, and made sure it was densely packed. I only had enough cotton scraps to fully fill one, which was really the only one that I needed at the moment. So I'll fill the others when I get more scraps. I still couldn't perfect lowering the darts, so I stuck with the original, which turned out fine. So what I ended up doing was widening the waist to have some breathing room. Made sure the back template aligned with the front template, brought the shoulder strap position closer to the center by 1 inch on both templates. Made thicker straps, and marked where they would go. For the skirt part, I went with the waist measurement, but had to shorten the bottom by 5 inches to accommodate the length of my fabric. I used this cotton fabric. I wanted a continuous 4 yards, but the fabric only came pre-cut in 2 yards, so I got 2 and adjusted my skirt measurement. I got an invisible zipper, thread, and this sewing gouge. I washed my fabric, ironed it, and cut out my pieces. I marked where the darts would go, and added a seam allowance to the curved darts. I also marked where the darts would end, so that they would align. Then sewed the darts and knotted the ends. I always ironed after sewing any part. Then cut slits around the curves. And used the Tailor's ham that I made. I attached the back pieces to the front and pressed the seams open. For my straps, I used Shape Flex interfacing. I folded, sewed, pressed the seams open, trimmed the seam allowance, and turned it inside out. Then made sure the seams were on the back of the straps. Positioned them on the bodice and sewed. Next, I sewed the lining to the bodice. Cut slits by the curves, ironed the seam allowance toward the lining side, and sewed 1/8 of an inch from the seam. This was called an understitch. I aligned the outer layer with the skirt. Sewed them together, added a zigzag stitch, and pressed the seam allowance up toward the bodice. I also added a zigzag stitch to the edge of the bodice and center back part of the skirt. To strengthen the straps, I sewed the ends to the seam allowance, using a zigzag stitch. Since I don't have a zipper foot, I ironed the curled zipper coils flat on a low setting. Then sewed as close as I could to the coils. I watched a tutorial on how to attach the zipper nicely between the two layers, which is linked in the description. I left a little gap at the top, pinned my zipper, marked where the zipper would end, sewed close to the coils, and made sure the seams were aligned. This turned out great, except that my seam allowance for this part was supposed to be 2 centimeters, not 1. So I undid it, moved it another centimeter, and sewed it again. I pinned the rest of the center back part of the skirt together. Moved the zipper end out of the way, and sewed the skirt part until the machine stopped me. There was only a tiny gap that couldn't be sewn. I cut the zipper, leaving 1 inch at the end, and used a lighter to seal it. I later sewed the ends of the zipper. Then I pinned the top of the zipper at an angle. Covered it with a lining and seam allowance, and sewed the edge using a slightly bigger seam allowance. I folded the bottom of the lining up, aligning it with the seam. And sewed. I turned the top part inside out and checked the alignments. I decided to cover the zigzag stitch to have a cleaner look. I cut strips to make my bias tape, and ironed it in fourths. I started from under the bodice. I sewed, folded the strip over, sewed, and ironed. I hand stitched the bottom of the bodice lining, making sure that the seams aligned. I sewed the folded part to the seam allowance using a ladder stitch. I made sure not to sew through the front. The pattern had ruffles, but it made the dress look more casual, so I didn't add it. To finish the circle skirt part of the dress, I sewed 0.7 centimeters from the raw edge. Folded it over and pressed it, folded it again and sewed. I also stitched the end of the zipper. And here's how it turned out.